Today's episode is brought to you by LaRosse Media. They make professional videos to fit any budget, so next time you need a commercial, promo, or corporate video, think LaRosse. Check them out at larossemedia.com.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Stinking Albatross Podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Alissa Golob. And today on our podcast, we have a very special guest, Bryan Breguet, who is a professor of economics at Langara College in Vancouver in beautiful British Columbia. And not more importantly, but for our purposes here on the podcast, he is also the founder of the often used and often referenced to polling analysts blog website called Too Close to Call, which he started during the 2011 federal election. So hi, Alissa, and thanks for coming on the podcast, Bryan.
Hi, Scott. Hi, Alissa. Thank you so much for inviting me. I love the name. I love the name of the podcast.
When we first started the podcast, I was very, very ill prepared for the very first episode, and Alissa had done all this research, and she said, "Do you even know where the name comes from, Scott?" And I said, "Well, yeah, you know, it comes from Peter MacKay, what he said about social conservatives and blah, blah, blah." But she knew like the poem and the lines and everything like that. And I was ill prepared. Not only for that, but there's a few other questions that Alissa threw in there for me.
I like to make you look as stupid as possible sometimes as I can.
It's a very low bar. So good for you for jumping right over. And it looks like everyone followed the color code today, which is black
Yes.
for the middle of summer. So good job, everybody.
Absolutely.
Well, Bryan, I wanted to get right into it here. And I guess our first question to kind of introduce to our listeners and our viewers is, how did you get into analyzing polling, particularly in Canadian politics? And as someone who analyzes polls often, what should people consider when they look at polling numbers, particularly horse race polling numbers between various political parties?
All right. Well, I created my blog on 2011. I think I was doing it before on other websites or social media. It's really mostly a question of, I like numbers, I like elections. And back then, there weren't that many people doing projections. I mean, there was Eric Grenier at 308 back then. Right. You had the first one to really do this. I mean, I think we tend to forget was the guy who had Democratic Space. I mean, he hasn't updated his website in years now. He's a professor of urbanism, I believe. But that's really the first one who was doing those projections, 2004, 2006. And he was pretty good at it. And so that was really, I started doing it because I wanted to be able to make my own projections, right? To be able to run scenarios and things like this. And so I just continue. And honestly, even to this day, this is mostly the main reason. It's really because I want to be able to do my own scenario. I want to be able to look at what would happen without having to rely on anybody else's model, right? So I think that's the main reason and how I started. What should people be careful about? Well, despite the obvious, beyond the obvious margin of errors, polling errors, this type of thing that we always have, I think obviously if we're translating to seats, we need to know that popular vote is often very meaningless in Canada. We've seen it at the last two federal elections. We've seen it in BC, the federal level where the Liberals finished third, but first in seats. Otherwise, I would say the one thing, all of this, I mean, people know, right? I think the one thing people don't realize enough, and I talk a lot about this, is how they deal with undecided. So when they do a poll, they select people, whether it's online or by phone, and they ask them, right? Hey, are you a Canadian citizen? Yes, no. Are you gonna vote next election? And then they ask, which, if the election were tomorrow, who would you vote for? And after this, you always have between 5 and 20% of people who say, I don't know, or I'm undecided. And we don't usually report on those because what most pollsters do is they're just going to drop these people. They like to say they do a proportional allocation of undecided, but mathematically it's the same as just assuming you drop these people because you don't know how they're going to vote. And as I said, when it's 2 or 3%, it doesn't matter. But when you have 10, 15, 20%, depending, assuming that those undecided will break the same way as decided voters is very wrong, in my opinion. And I get why they're doing this, is because they don't want to start making assumptions. They don't want to start, looking like they're biased for one party. But I disagree with this. And I think we have many instances, in particular the Alberta election recently, where if you were to allocate undecided proportionally, you would have been very wrong.
Right. And this is the house bias, right? That we see in polling numbers, that we often hear that term. Is that what you're referring to?
No, our house bias is more like the fact that your methodology and your panel tends to, both of them will tend to skew one way or another. So that's more like, polls after polls after polls, you end up slightly more liberal, so more conservative than the average. So that, and, I mean, Kudo Maggie hates me on Twitter, but I mean, we have a very clearly established house bias from Main Street against the NDP. It usually works in their favor because then the NDP, they underperform and they do worse than the polls. But it's almost two mistakes canceling out. And so, so I think it's just a question of who they select and how they select their sample. Somehow they don't reach enough people who vote NDP, or at least less or fewer people than other pollsters. It doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means that, they do things slightly differently. So that's their house bias. The undecided, it's to avoid having another house bias that they don't. And again, it looks like the neutral option, where you're like, well, we're doing proportional allocation. And you're like, yeah, okay, but it's still an assumption. You're still assuming they will either not vote or they will vote like other people. And I'm like, both assumptions are very wrong. And, I don't do this personally, but I'm very upfront with the assumptions I make. So
Now, you sort of answered this question in your previous answer, but I was wondering, and I know like Scott, he's been blocked and had some arguments with some pollsters on the World Wide Web, particularly Twitter as well. So my question is, besides yourself, obviously, who do you think is the best pollster in Canada and who do you think is the worst?
So I think the best pollster or polling company, let's use the term polling company so that, we're talking about the company, not the actual person.
I want person. No, I'm just
fine.
We want names.
I feel obviously Leger 360, right, has been by far the best polling firm in the last few years. I mean, overall, not every single election, but overall, they've been very, very good. So, I mean, they have a lot of, credibility at this point. It hasn't always been the case. I mean, if you go back 10 years ago or 15 years ago, they've had a few misses out there, but overall, recently, they've done really, really well. After them, I would say, and I hope Kudo Maggie is listening, I think Main Street can be quite good. They're sometimes very, very off, but overall, I think Main Street is quite good, and I have to give them credit for they poll everything all the time. They do by-elections, provincial elections.
Yeah, they get into those riding polls, eh?
Yes, exactly. So at least, they have the courage to go out there, and sometimes they're very wrong. Like there was a by-election in Montreal where Quebec Solidaire won, and their riding poll was off by like 20, 30, 40 points. But overall, they're pretty good, and I quite like Main Street. I think your question should be more, who are the worst pollsters in Canada? And well, I think in terms of, if you're looking at the actual horse race numbers, Ecos hasn't been particularly good out there. I mean, they tend to have really weird numbers, especially at the further level, weird variations. Forum used to be a joke between elections, but they used to be spot on for every election. That was very funny. They would be really widely off before the last poll of every campaign, but they're not really active anymore. And I mean, I hate to say this because I love innovative research. I mean, I think they do a really, really good job, and their polls are, it's like 50 pages PDF with so many questions that nobody else would ask, but their horse race numbers are systematically off. Like really, really, you and quite often, I don't even include them in my average. I know it's, I shouldn't do this, but I sit and I'm like, I know it's wrong. I can look at this. There is no way you're right. I'm not gonna skew my average for you. So I'm not sure why. I think they don't care as much. They care more about everything else, and they don't care if they're the most accurate pollster out there. But it's a little bit unfortunate because you're gonna get like, they would release an Alberta poll with the Liberals at like 10%. And we're like, well, they're running 6 candidates, so they're not going to get 10%.
Right. Now, you are a very passionate advocate for proportional representation, those types of systems of elections, as opposed to what we have in Canada, which is our current first past the post. So, I guess kind of a two-part question is, could you please explain to our listeners and viewers the difference between proportional representation versus first past the post, and what if Canada were to adopt a proportional representation system, because there are various options within that, what sort of proportional representation system do you think we should adopt in Canada? And if this were, sorry, three-part question, and if this were to be adopted in Canada, do you think that social conservatives could take advantage of such a system?
Okay. So, well, and you mentioned it yourself, right? You have many types of proportional system, but overall, what they all have in common is the number of seats you get will be proportional to the popular vote, right? So not 1-to-1. It's really rare. It's not like if you get 22% of the vote, you will get exactly 22% of the seats, but roughly this is what will happen, right? You have some plus or minus there, but you cannot have a situation like, the NDP who get like 18%, they will get fewer seats than the Bloc who get 7 or 8%. That could not happen. We know in our system in particular, it's very difficult to, you could be at 15, 20, 25%, and you will get very few seats, right? Let's just think of the Conservative Party in Quebec, last provincial election. They got 12 or 13%, just 1 or 2% less than the Liberals. And they got 0 seats, and the Liberals are the official opposition. So this wouldn't happen with any type of decent proportional representation. The downside is obviously getting a majority means you most likely need to be maybe not at 50% of the votes, but I would say 45 would most likely do it. And nobody gets 45%, not even Trudeau in 2015, not Harper in 2011. So the area of single party majorities at the federal level would be over, essentially. So that's the first question. The second one is, which system would I like? I personally really like STV, right? The single transferable vote. That's what BC wanted to do in 2005 and 2009. This is a system where it's not in itself a proportional system, but it gives proportional results. You end up with, essentially, it's ranked ballots. So when you go and vote, you would rank 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But your riding has multiple MPs or MLAs. So you could live in a riding that has 5 or 6. And you would end up with multiple Liberals candidates and multiple Conservative candidates. So that's what I really like, because now the party cannot impose you the candidates they want. We just saw in the by-election in Oxford how people really don't like sometimes when the elites of a party, they would impose their candidates.
Really? Because I was told the reason for that was everyone was racist in there.
Yes.
That is true. That is exactly what happened. And so STV, I really like it because it gives you a way to rank even within parties. So I quite like the system. The downside is it's really complicated to explain the mechanism. Like if you really want to understand it, you have to do some math. Personally, I don't think it's that bad of an issue because, as long as people trust that the people counting the votes do it right, that should be okay, right? I mean, I don't know how my computer works, but I believe I trust it to use it, right? But I get the downside. So the other solution, I think, for Canada would be some sort of what we call MMP, multi-member, or, the German system. So you end up with 2 types of MPs. You still vote for your local MP that will represent the riding, and you have this local connection, but you also vote for the party. And what happens is if a party gets, let's say you get 20% of the votes, but you only get 5 MPs, and you're supposed to get 50 MPs, then we're going to give you those additional MPs. But those MPs, where they come from, they could come from a list, or they could be the best losers. I quite like the idea of going, we're going to go, if we're the NDP, we're going to go find the NDP candidates that finish second with the highest percentage of votes. Right. And we're like, well, you finished second, but you're still popular, so we're taking you. So people, because usually people don't like when it comes from a list you don't have a say about, because again, the party could just impose their names and you don't have a choice. So there are different systems. That's the system that Ontario was proposing in 2007. That's the system that Quebec was studying both in 2003 under Georges Charest and in 2018 under François Legault. So I think it's quite popular. I quite like the system because it's simpler than STV. And then we could do it by province or by big regions within province. And what it would do is you would start having MPs representing not their little riding, not Vancouver East or Burnaby North, but they would represent BC or the Fraser Valley, whatever. It depends how big we want those regions. And I think that could be quite good for our system to have regional or provincial MPs whose allegiance and constituencies, they're not just one city somewhere. So, and I think it would actually reinforce province or provincial representation at the House of Commons. So that's the two systems I'm okay with. We can go very fancy with modern systems. I don't think it's necessary. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have systems that have been proven out there. They work. So why wouldn't we do this? And your last question was, would it help social conservative in Canada? I think the answer clearly would be yes, in my opinion, in the sense that right now, social conservative, they don't have their own party, right? They exist within the Conservative Party. That's what they do, right? Leslie Lewis would be the spokeswoman for such a movement, I would say. Some of them are most likely with the PPC, but it's not really logical. The PPC is this weird populist, libertarian, social conservative when they're running in, German Manitoba, but not when they're running for the leadership. So, I mean, they're a little bit confused sometimes. So realistically, it's a small share, what's small, it depends, of the Conservative Party. But what kind of power do they have right now? If you think about somebody like Leslie Lewis, who almost won in 2020, she was really, really close, still did pretty well in 2022, not remotely as well because, she got hurt by the Poilievre train and, but she finished with almost as many votes as Georges Charest. So she still managed to get 10, 12% of the votes despite having to face Pierre Poilievre. So does she have any power nowadays? I mean, she gets reprimanded when she meets with the German elected member on her own time. I don't see her very much, in front of the cameras. I mean, could she get any legislation passed or by the Poilievre camp? I don't think so. I think such a movement would be much more powerful if we had proportional representation. They could have their own party. They would get 10, 15% Canada-wide, maybe way more in Saskatchewan or Alberta, and then they could become the kingmaker. And they could be like, yeah, we will support you, but we want this and this. And now those conditions are very clearly established. Now, if you want Leslie Lewis to vote for you a budget, you need to give her this and that. I mean, right now, she doesn't have this leverage. I don't believe she does. Maybe I'm mistaken and I don't know enough of the, internal caucus dynamic, but I don't believe that she has this power right now.
Or any group within the Conservative caucus or the Liberal caucus for that matter. It's one of those things because you look across the pond in the United Kingdom and then, of course, they have twice the population, but they also have twice the size of the House because most ridings in the United Kingdom, which of course also has a first past the post Westminster parliamentary system, they have roughly 100,000 people per riding like we do. But it's not like they have double the size of the cabinets. Their cabinets are still roughly 30 cabinet ministers. So if you have a majority caucus like the Conservatives do in the United Kingdom, your chances of being in cabinet are basically half of what your chances would be in a majority caucus, Conservative caucus here in Canada. So your inclination to be overly cooperative, let's say, with the current leader, in the United Kingdom is going to be much lower than in Canada because you already know that your chance of being in cabinet is going to be very low. Whereas in Canada, your chance of being in cabinet or a parliamentary secretary or perhaps a chair of a committee of the House of Commons, all of which come with various pay increases, is basically 50%. So I don't think you see that dynamic, unfortunately, in Canada, federally or provincially for that reason. But so is it fair to say like your single transferable ballot would be something like what we see in most political party leadership races in Canada, where you have your ranked ballot, and then your mixed member parliament would be, I'm voting for my, let's say, Conservative MP specifically, but the party I want to vote for is the PPC. Would that be a fair way to sum that up?
Yes, so with the one difference from the point of view of the elector, of the voters, yes, you're right. STV would be exactly like what we do at any leadership race where we rank our candidates. How votes are counted would be different, right? Because again, we're trying to elect maybe 3 or 4.
Right,
So
right.
So essentially, we need to reach a certain number of votes. If you don't have enough, then we remove the last one. So it's the same process, except we don't stop until one person is at 50 plus 1. We stop when we have 4 people who have enough votes, but the logic behind it is essentially the same. And that's, again, STV is difficult for the people who count the votes, but for the people who are actually the voters, you just go and you rank. You don't have to think for 10 minutes. You just like, I like this and this one, and then, as I said, you could rank within party, right? So if you want the Liberals but you don't like one of the 2 candidates, that's okay. Just rank this second Liberal candidate as 5th, and you put the one you like as number 1. So that gives you a lot of power over the parties. And I remember that when BC had their legislative assembly, I was in university, and I had Audrey Blais at the University of Montreal, who's an expert on elections. And he had spoken to the people, he went as an expert to talk to the citizen assembly. And he told us in class, he said, I think BC and people in BC don't really trust their politicians and their parties much more than in the rest of Canada. And I believe that they would choose the STV just because to stick it up to the parties, because they don't want the parties to be able to impose them. And he was right. That's the system that the citizen assembly chose. So he was very good at this. So I like this quite a lot. For MMP or the German system, yes, that's exactly. You have system where you can only vote once. And so if you vote for a candidate, it counts as a vote for the party. I think that's too bad because, the system allows you to do, we can design it with 2 votes. And I really like the idea of 2 votes, right? You can vote for your local, conservative candidates because you like him or her, but you think the PPC should have seats as well, but you maybe don't like your local PPC candidate. And so you split your vote between the 2. So it gives you more power as well. Electoral expert would tell you that when we allow 2 votes, some people, we have more spoiled ballots. Some people make a mistake in one or the other, but it's still very, very small. I don't think it's a valid reason to not give this power, right? I mean, ultimately, what I want is more power to the people. And I want them to be able to select among more parties, more candidates, more granularity within a party, rather than what happens now when you live in Oxford. If you don't want Trudeau, you have to vote for the guy we imposed you on the ballot, which I don't think it's very good.
Now, in the most recent past, I guess, what was your greatest polling call that was a hit when most pollsters missed? And conversely, what was your greatest polling call miss?
Okay, so I'm going to start with the miss. I think it's a tie. So I was lucky enough, I think technically in terms of numbers, it's probably BC 2013, right? When I had the NDP winning.
When the Liberals won.
The NDP winning. But this one, I don't feel too bad because polls were very wrong. Everybody was wrong. I would say if I look at an election where in hindsight, I'm like, wow, I should have done better. I'm going to go with either 2019 at the federal level or 2015. 2015, there as well, very last minute swing, strong momentum in Quebec for the Liberals. Unless you only use the polls of the last day, I don't think you could really predict the supermajority they won. 2019 is the one where I think I should have done better. If I go back and you look at the polls in Ontario and the GTA, I mean, I should have adjusted my model, and I did change my model after 2019. So that's probably the big miss, the one I would like to have back. My biggest success, I mean, I've had quite a lot, really, really good calls, like Alberta right now, recently Quebec. Last year I was really good, but those, I think other people were doing really well. I'm going to go with the Conservative leadership of last year because I think I was the one covering it the most, and it's more difficult to cover a leadership race. And, I was doing a mix of fundraising, polling, and Google Trends. And I even managed to do riding level projections. And I think I was really, really pretty spot on. I had Poilievre at 63 or 65, he got 68. But I had everybody where they should be. I even had within province, I knew where Worcestershire would be strong, like within Toronto, Ottawa, or Montreal. So I think that was a pretty good showing. And if I ever have to show, in a job interview, show us that you can deal with data and manipulate data, I would show them my map of the projections with the fundraising, because that was tricky to do. And I don't think anybody else came close to the coverage I offered during this race.
But Bryan, Shrey had the points.
He did have the points, yeah. I still want to know, one day I wish I could just ask him or ask Tasha, were they lying or did they truly believe they had the points? I still don't know. I still don't know if they were stupid or lying. And it's sad that I don't know. But
it could be, it could be a combination, right? It doesn't
They're
have
both
to be
stupid and liars.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be either or. It could be an and both situation.
We live in a world that grows through communication.
Every connection comes from a dream to be heard and realized.
To welcome a better future. What are your dreams?
LaRosse Media will help communicate your vision through our professional video production services and marketing strategies.
Start building connections to your future audience. Visit larossemedia.com
and be sure to check out our extended service options.
Dream, produce, market, succeed with LaRosse Media.
Serving Canada from coast to coast to coast.
So one thing we want to do with you is we want to take a tour across the country, because many of our listeners and viewers are from all parts of the country. And so because you're an avid follower of the polls on your blog, Too Close to Call, we're wondering if we could just do a go province by province, go west from east, because west is the best. And then just quickly within 10 provinces, within 10 minutes or less, if you could tell us province by province, what is the current polling situation from your perspective for that particular province's next election? Where do you think it's going to go, and what roughly the results would be? Not in terms of like a seat count, but roughly what you think the results would be, and a specific question we kind of have about that province. So yeah, let's see if we can get this
rapid fire.
Yeah, 10 minutes or less. So let's start beautiful British Columbia. So Bryan, could you tell us in BC what the current polling situation is? What do you think the result will be for the next provincial election, which is my understanding, I think next year, if I recall? And my specific question for BC is, do you think that between now and the next election that the BC Conservatives can overtake the BC United?
All right, so in BC, the polls are very, very clear. The NDP is winning. They're well ahead of the now called BC United, right? Formerly BC Liberals.
The football club.
I think that, yeah, exactly. I think there is absolutely no question that the NDP would win tomorrow. I cannot see them losing next year. I think it's almost a foregone conclusion that the NDP with David Eby will win another majority. Maybe not as big as last time, but at least in votes, but they will win. It's really a race for second place. And the big change is really that BC United is doing really, really bad. They're polling under what Andrew Wilkinson got in 2020 with COVID, when COVID was there. And really, yeah, the movement is, there is this new, rebranded Conservative Party of BC that seems a lot more organized. They have a better leader now. I don't know if I want to say better, but more established leader that is a former BC Liberals MLA. They've been polling really well, like within striking distance, sometimes within 10 points, like 27 to 16 with the BC United. It wouldn't take much to convert a little bit more of those BC United voters who don't like Kevin Falcon. So this is what we are. Could they overtake? Yes, I think so. I think if we're in an election where anyway the NDP wins, you're a right-wing voter, why would you waste your vote on Kevin Falcon?
All right. So in Alberta, was the 1,600 vote margin in 5 seats an aberration for the UCP, or is Calgary now a swing region provincially, do you think?
I think a little bit of both. I think obviously cities, we see it everywhere in North America or in the world. They're realigning more left. So I'm not surprised to see the NDP making gains. I think this particular election was a little bit unique because of the presence of Daniel Smith, right? It was like everything was perfect for the NDP. They had a popular leader with Rachel Notley, somebody that can not only get the progressive voters, but she's able to get those centrist Alberta voters, right? Even some federal CPC voters. And on the other hand, we had Daniel Smith, who was kind of a turnoff for some of those ex-PC voters. So it was, and despite all of this, it's still the case that the UCP won. So my personal take is, if the NDP didn't win this year, that was their one chance. Their next chance will come at some point, but it will come when people will be really, really tired of the UCP in power. And back then, when that happens, I actually don't know if the NDP will be the one taking, having a shot, or if it's another White Rose Reform Party forming as well. I really think that for the progressive, this election must have been heartbreaking because they were close and that was their one shot. Everything was aligning and it still didn't happen.
Okay, so next door in Saskatchewan, again, another province that has an election scheduled for next year. What's the current polling situation? What do you see the result of that next election going to be? And do you think that the NDP or the Sask United Party is a greater threat to the Saskatchewan Party for not forming a majority in the next election?
So I think I'm going to skip on this one, honestly, because that's probably one of the provinces I followed the least. So right. Saskatchewan, we know it's the most right-wing province in Canada now. It's not Alberta, it's Saskatchewan by far on every metric. So, if there is an election over there, it's going to be between two right-wing parties for sure. So that most likely answer your question, at least indirectly. But beyond this, who is leading and who isn't? Scott Moore is quite popular. So I would bet on him being reelected, but I haven't looked at the polling, and I don't think we get that many polls, regularly in Saskatchewan. Yeah. So we're gonna see when we're closer to the election. But I see no reason why he wouldn't be reelected. Every time, if you look at the Angus Reid, like a right. list of premier, he's always one of the top ones. So people quite like him. He's the right mix of populist, social conservative, and normal PC. He doesn't turn off the centrist voters, or at least not traditionally. So my bet would be on him winning again, but I might be completely wrong here.
Okay, so in Manitoba, is there enough time for Stephenson and the PCs to close the gap in Winnipeg for the election in the autumn?
Oh, yes, there is definitely, the trend is good for them. Yeah. Just a year or a few months ago, it looked horrible, but by now they're literally within the margin of error. And then, it will come down to a few seats, most likely in the suburb or in Winnipeg. So, for sure, if she can do a good campaign, and campaigns matter, debates matter. We just saw it in Alberta. Daniel Smith won this election by winning the campaign and by winning the debate. So there was definitely enough time. Maybe 2 years or a year ago, we would have thought that it was over and the NDP would win Manitoba. I don't think so. They could, but my guess is it's gonna come down to something more similar to Alberta, where it would be very, very close. It will come down to a few seats.
A few seats, so probably a few votes within those few seats, I would imagine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So going over to here in Ontario, where I am right now, what is the current polling situation? I know the next election isn't scheduled for until I believe 2026. So it's far to ask you to look into your crystal ball to see what the result would be. But what they talk about here in Ontario often is who's winning the progressive primary between the Liberals and the NDP. So do you think that finally one of those two parties will kind of break out of that 25, 26, 27% that they seem to share between each other to actually challenge the progressive Conservatives and maybe overtake Doug Ford? Or do you think that the two of those two parties will remain mired and kind of metastasized and around the same polling average?
Yeah, so I think this idea that there is like a primary on the left and one of the two parties will become the de facto opposition, that's wishful thinking. That's what people were saying already last time, and it didn't happen. Yep. I think those parties, the Liberals and NDP, they don't like each other very much, and they really cannot agree as to which one should be the main opposition. The NDP think they have the claim because they have more seats. The Liberals are like, yeah, but we're the only one who can win in the 905. So, we're below you, but we could easily be above you. So we will see. I mean, the NDP has a new leader that seems okay. I mean, after, decades of an Angela Howard that was really, really bad at debate. So, I mean, from what I saw, at least Merit Stiles, she's better in debate. So maybe that will do her some, or do the party some good. The Liberals, they're in the middle of a leadership race that nobody cares about. It really generates zero attention. I don't see any super strong candidate. I mean, Nate Erskine-Smith is the darling of Twitter, but I don't think he's that big in the real world. Bonnie Crombie. I mean, if we imagine a situation where the centrist boomers are tired of Doug Ford by next time, I think they would most likely be looking at Bonnie Crombie if she's the leader. So that, I mean, I would bet on her if she managed to win this election. But it really comes down more than ever that what happens to the PC. Is Doug Ford still popular? Can he maintain? He's not that popular, but he manages to keep his coalition very, very happy. And his coalition is enough with 38% of the vote, and very efficient in the 905 thanks to the Doug Ford effect. So at this point, I think another Doug Ford majority would most likely be the likely scenario at this point, but unless he really start making a lot of mistakes.
I have an insultingly terrible French accent, so I'm going to pass on Quebec to Scott again.
Okay. All right. So in Quebec, again, a province that just had its provincial election last autumn. So again, not again until 2026. And the CAQ, the Coalition Avenir de Québec, has a rather large majority in the National Assembly. But do you foresee that CAQ support starting to bleed enough to the Parti Québécois as well as the Parti Conservateur provincially in Quebec, or is their stranglehold on the National Assembly just as solid as it ever was?
No, the CAQ is definitely much weaker than they used to be. I mean, the polls show it, in particular in the Quebec region.
Yeah.
So I think there is a big opening for somebody to maybe not win next election, but at the very least, like reduce the CAQ to a much smaller, if not a minority. I think it's
more like around 60 seats or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
93 or whatever they have.
But the party that actually is really well positioned at this point is the Parti Québécois, right? With Paul Sapir Plamondon. He's a very popular leader. He has stuck to his principle throughout like the last leadership and election. He did win. He got very lucky to win. Like, let's be clear, he won because the Quebec Solidaire candidate had to withdraw because she's a dumbass who decided to steal a flyer in the
I remember that.
So, I mean, he's really, otherwise I don't think he would have won his riding. So, but I mean, right now polls are really good for them. They're now back to second place with 25%. And they're the only one who, they have the support that is distributed in such a way that they could start hurting the CAQ in Quebec City. They could start hurting, and in particular in the 4-5 or the Montreal suburb. They're the only one. The Liberals don't exist anymore. We're part of the Conservative. I think that was the one shot and they didn't get anything out of it. So I think they might just go down and disappear at some point. Quebec Solidaire is highly concentrated. They will keep their seats, but they cannot really expand that much. Their next expansion will most likely be taking the Liberals, I would say, like in Montreal, and really all of the island would be orange. So Parti Québécois is the one to look at. And this morning or yesterday, we learned that one of the CAQ MLAs resigning in Jean Talon in Quebec City. That used to be a really, really strong riding for the Liberals. They know where to be seen. So it's one of those ridings, those by-elections that will be really insightful because almost all the parties could have a claim to it. And I think if the Parti Québécois want to show that we have the momentum, we're the opposition next time, they should win it. But if they can maintain this momentum and they go into the next election as you won't change and we can give it to you, and they don't screw up with like saying, we're going to do a referendum after 2 months, I wouldn't be surprised if the Parti Québécois wins next time. That's not impossible.
Wow. Okay. That's quite the change.
Yes. Yeah. No. For sure. That's a party that was almost dead, right? I mean, at some point,
that's like a 2015. That's like a 2015 federal Liberal thing, right? Going from third in the House to all the way to a majority, a comfortable majority.
But they're the second choice of everybody. That's what really helps them. You ask, and in particular, they're by far the main second choice of CAQ voter, because the CAQ started as the this right-wing ADQ,
Yeah.
like small, like essentially what the Conservative Party is now in Quebec. And then they grew over time. Then they ate the Liberals, like the centrist, center-right Jean Charest voters. And then they ate the Parti Québécois nationalist, centrist, countryside voters. So, but the Parti Québécois could get them back. They could get them back in the countryside, in the Montreal region. So if they manage to do this and they're well positioned to do so in the event that people are really tired of François Legault, yeah, they could go from 2 to 65. Yeah.
Now, New Brunswick has been in the news a lot lately, not so much in the last week or so. Things have kind of calmed down a little bit. But do you think that this is just the dog days of summer, or are his opponents internally and externally plotting his demise? And can he win both the party and across the province amongst the electorate and in the next provincial election?
Yeah, right. We were almost promised an election on this, right? I don't know, and so we're not getting it. I'm really disappointed because A, that would have been an election, and B, I was really interested to see an election on this topic because the polls were really overwhelmingly in favor of telling parents. I think he's still in good position. Polls, even if he's not crushing the popular vote, we know the Liberals, they waste a lot of their vote in the north, like the French part of the province. So electorally, the map is better for the Conservative. Unless, if there was an election like soon, unless he really, really cannot defend his position on the main issue, I don't see any reason why his party wouldn't win the most seats, at least. We know things can switch very quickly, right? However, in Atlantic Canada, and a lot of politics is very local, much more than anywhere in the country. But the surface level, from what I see, I think I would still call the current premier the favorite and the PC favorite to win the next election.
Now let's get our politics even more local to New Brunswick and go to the island, not Vancouver Island, but the other island on the other side of the coast in Prince Edward Island, where they just had their provincial election earlier this year, a little bit earlier than it was scheduled. And Dennis King and the Progressive Conservatives finally won their majority government. Correct me if I'm wrong, and then there was a switch in the official opposition, I believe, from Greens back to Liberals, but it was only by on one seat difference. So what's the and like if there's one province besides Saskatchewan where there's going to be even less polling at a provincial level, it's going to be Prince Edward Island. So this might be a bit of a difficult question, but from your analysis, if you have one right now, what is kind of the polling situation in Prince Edward Island? And I mean, we're many, many years now from the next election, but do you see any difference on the island, or do you think there's at least one more majority turn to be had out of Dennis King and the Progressive Conservatives?
It's really, really hard to tell, right? On one hand, when you look at the recent results, you would be like, you're safe for a few years, right? As long as you don't screw up with policies. On the other hand, PI is very small. Their parties are they're very, very similar, right? Sometimes the Liberals are almost more right-wing than the PC.
Yep.
We've seen very wide swings in PI. So who's there to, I cannot confidently say, oh no, we're not gonna see a Liberal surge or NDP or Green surge in the province. That's really one province that would benefit from having proportional representation. They came very, very close a few times to implement it. And it's one of the few provinces where almost all parties are not completely opposed to it. It's not like BC or the federal level where you have, especially the right-wing parties are like, we hate it. It's the end of the world. We're going to be a socialist hellhole if we do this. When in PI, they're like, yeah, okay, maybe we could do this. So I'm optimistic that might happen. But beyond this, it's way too difficult. Logically, it should be another PC because when you win with such a wide margin, you have a margin of error for the next time. But it's PEI. I mean, honestly, you go from 10 to 60% of the votes, like easier than in any other province.
Producer Dave can correct me if I'm wrong when you're talking about like PEI being open to systematic electoral change. But my understanding, I think it was into the 90s, the Legislative Assembly of Prince Edward Island had every riding got to elect 2 MLAs, one for the Catholics and the other for the Protestants. Keep the peace.
I'm sure it worked. All right, let's swing over to Nova Scotia. Can the Liberals continue to slide all the way behind the NDP in the seat count in the next election, do you think?
That's possible, right? I mean, we know Atlantic Canada is like one of the last region where the Liberal brand still exists, really, I would say. And depending on what happens, I wouldn't be surprised if they get replaced. Ultimately, the issue is there is a very centrist PC party that is popular. And I think, when the Liberals cannot get this vote, the centrist vote, they cease to exist, right? Because they're like, well, why are we even here for, right? On the left, the NDP exists. On the right, the PC exists. So the ingredients are there for another, province that would just become where the Liberals 20 years from now, they would have to rebrand themselves and, adopt an ugly name and ugly logo like everywhere in Western Canada. We'll see, right? I mean, we've seen last election in Nova Scotia where all of a sudden the PC won a little bit out of nowhere. So we know it's another one of those provinces where politics is very local, much more than in Ontario, Quebec, or BC. And parties are closer to each other than in the rest of the country. So it allows for easier swing because you can easily switch from one party to the next. So, but as it stands right now, yeah, I mean, next election is still easy PC majority.
Okay, and then our final one, we didn't get this done in 10 minutes, by the way. but we tried. We did our best. Final one, we're out to the rock. No offense to our listeners in Labrador, but what is the current polling situation there from your analysis? What do you think the result will be for the next election? And right now, the Progressive Conservatives obviously are in the middle of their leadership race. Do you think a new leader for that party will actually make the Progressive Conservatives more competitive with the Liberals, or do you think that those numbers will kind of just stay lock and step?
Yeah, there's what, and I'm far from an expert in Newfoundland. What I know from them is probably the province they love their Liberals the most, right? I mean, it's really difficult for them to vote anything but Liberals. It seems that they really like the name and the politics. So right now the Liberals are, and we get very few polls, right? Again, we need, for the audience, people need to realize that it's not Quebec or Ontario where we get a poll every 2 weeks. We get one every few months, right? So I mean, and not necessarily from the best firm, but right now it seems, the Liberals would be winning. But there as well, sometimes people between elections, they don't pay attention. You said there was a leadership happening. Let's remember that their last election, the Liberal, they called an early election, right? And they were like, oh, it looks so good. We're going to cruise to a super majority. And I'm pretty sure if the election had been 2 weeks longer, they might have lost this election. So we'll see. But as I said, it does, the default position of Newfoundland is Liberals. And it takes something relatively big for them to switch to another party.
All right, now let's switch over to federal politics because I know that's what you like to talk about. Can you give us an analysis of where, it's mid-July, where each of the parties are right now? And if there was an election in 2025, what do you think the results would be given what we're seeing today?
So right now, I think if we trust the polls, we're in a situation where the Conservative would win the popular vote again. They would win it probably by, let's say, 4 to 5 points. I'm guessing 35, 36 to 29 to 31 for the Liberals. In terms of seat distribution, I think it would be very, very close. Like both parties would most likely be around 135 to 145. It really depends. Sometimes we get really good polls for one or the other. So the Liberals still have, at this point, we don't have any reason to believe that the Conservatives are high enough in Ontario to finally win the 905. That's really, I think, the issue. I mean, they are closer, right? The polls, because they lost 2021 like 39 to 35, right? In Ontario. Polls right now put the Conservative essentially tied 36 with the Liberals, or sometimes a little bit ahead. So that's a good swing of 4 to 5 points that would translate into seats, but not enough to really beat the Liberals. So I think that's the main issue. BC looks good for the Conservative. Atlantic Canada looks really, really good for the Conservative, and I think they would make many gains. But Ontario is still not breaking. We're very, very close to breaking. I mean, we're talking like 1 or 2 points higher for Poilievre, and I would be very confident in telling you that the Conservative would be at 150, 160 seats. But right now, that's not the case. And then we need to be cautious, right? Because what the polls are telling us doesn't line up at all with what we've seen in by-elections.
Yeah.
And by-elections are by-elections, but when you get like now 4 or 5, and we get the same pattern, then there is some information out there. I don't understand why so many people on Twitter they're like, oh, it doesn't matter, everything's good. I'm like, you just lost like 20 points in Oxford, you lost like in Winnipeg, I mean, it's not looking good. You didn't make any gains in Mississauga lecture. I mean, why do you think that all of a sudden, if there was a general election, you would do better? So I mean, very close. It's an improvement over 2021, right, when O'Toole won only like 126 or 21, but
119.
Yeah, 19, yeah, but not enough to go and win government. So that would be one of those elections where the campaign would really make the difference, and the debate and the operation to get the vote out, right? And
You're vindicating. Yeah.
I'm gonna nerd out hard here. And anyone comment on this, but we have a group chat with a few of our friends, and it was a legit question leading up to these past 4 by-elections that occurred a month ago today, actually. So we're recording this on July 19th, and those elections were on June 19th. And it was a question like, do by-elections matter? Are they indicative of anything? And I honestly didn't really know the answer, so it's like, okay, well, they can't mean nothing, but at the same time, like, I understand, like, that they're almost like real polls, but they're only for like specific regions. So surely if you strung enough by-elections together in a parliament in between general elections, you're going to get some sort of trend. And so when I looked at it, all the by-elections between 2011 and 2015, between those two general federal elections, there were only, I think, of the 15 by-elections, there are only 2, maybe 3 seats that actually changed. So if you look at like, okay, who's keeping the seats, you're like, oh, well, there's not going to be much of a difference. Therefore, the Conservatives are likely to retain their majority. But if you look at the swing in the popular vote, it was extremely indicative of what the swing in the popular vote was going to be in the subsequent general. Same thing between 2015 and 2019. Now, between 2019 and 2021, there were only 2 by-elections, York Centre and I forget the other one. But even then, those 2 by-elections, even though it's a super small sample size, it actually was somewhat indicative of the swing that happened in the 2021 general. So yeah, we are like, we're like you said, Brian, we now have 5 by-elections in the bag. We have one coming up in 5 days in Calgary Heritage. We have another that's sometime going to happen in Durham, probably before the end of the year. That's almost half of the number of by-elections for the 15 that happened in the 41st Parliament and the 18 that happened in the 42nd. Like, we're getting a little bit closer to seeing a trend that's establishing. Obviously, the general election that's going to occur, the 45th, the next general federal election's probably not for 2 years. So, I mean, there's still time for swings to happen and events to happen. But yeah, like, I agree with you. Like, they're not nothing. Right? Like, that they are, like, it's real data and it is indicative. And it is interesting that the polls thus far, especially since the leadership change for the Conservatives, just haven't really translated. And I don't know if that's because the party needs to change its machinery in terms of the get out the vote effort to get better to the Liberals, or, maybe there is a bit of a PR discount currently, or this sounds odd to say, maybe there is a Justin premium. Like, I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to know. But what I do know, and I think what we can all agree on, is that the by-election results, which probably matter more, are not necessarily in line with what we're seeing with the polling.
No, it absolutely doesn't align. And the conservative, like, pundits or fans on Twitter, they always make excuses, right? They're like, oh, Mississauga lecture, well, Poilievre didn't go there and it's a strong Liberal candidate. Oxford is because, local effect, the previous MP endorsed, any racist, or any endorsed like the Liberal candidate. Winnipeg South Centre, well, whatever, this riding is lost. So, you always have like excuses, but I'm like, Winnipeg South Centre, Mississauga, those are seats where they might not be the best nowadays for the Conservative, but how do you win a majority? if you don't win those seats, because we're assuming, they're not going to break through in Quebec. That's not happening, not anytime soon, not with Poilievre. I don't see it happening. So how do you get to, over 170 now if you're so far behind in Mississauga Lakeshore, if you're so far behind in Winnipeg South Centre, sure, you may gain in Northern Ontario, Northern BC, the island, Newfoundland, you do this. That brings you to 140, 145. When do you go get the other seats? Either you need to completely break out in the 905, and we're not seeing this. And I can't wait for the by-election in the Erin O'Toole in Durham seat, because that's going to be another test. And, this is another place where if the Conservative, if their margin shrink, then we're going to hear excuses. Well, that's normal. That's the former leader. Yeah, but that's the former leader you all hated. You know what I mean?
Who also increased his raw vote and increased the percentage of his vote from 2019 to 2021, one of the very few ridings where they did that.
Yeah, to be fair, that makes sense. You become leader, you should get a little bit of a bonus, right? But at some point, when do we get good news? Like Portage Lisgar was pretty good. Okay, that worked. You went all in, and your candidate was pretty good, and you managed to crush Maxime Bernier. Not enough for him to resign, though. So, all of those efforts, and he's still at 20. He can still argue that he has a reason to be there. So, I don't know, we will see. But as you said, it's not indicative of wave for Poilievre. And I think, to be fair, nobody was expecting a Poilievre wave. I think we knew it would be, I was saying it in 2022, right? To me, was having Poilievre as leader kind of guarantees 140 seats, but 140 might not be enough. So you're going to have to go win more seats somewhere.
Well, let's talk about this. So let's talk about the next election, which, talking to my friends on Parliament Hill, it sounds like throughout the spring, more and more people just kind of accepted, like, this thing is going to go right to the bitter end in 2025, unless like something crazy happens. I think we saw, you could correct me if I'm wrong, Bryan, I think we saw from the financial returns, like the actual financial statements from the political parties for the year ended in 2022, that the NDP are still over $1 million in debts. For those you don't know, of all the political parties in Canada, the big federal ones, the NDP is the only one that actually owns their building for their headquarters. The rest of them just rent. And the way that the NDP typically finance their campaigns is they'll mortgage that building to get a $20 million loan to go out and basically finance their campaigns. So they're still paying that off, and they still probably have some time to pay that off. So it's not like they can really afford to go anytime soon. So let's just keep it to the Conservatives and the Liberals. What, in your opinion, as of today, as of July 19th, because when this goes out, the saying in politics is a week is an eternity in politics. So when this goes out, something completely could change. But as of today, in your opinion, looking at the polls and everything like that, what does Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, what do they need to do to win the next election? And let's define winning as, for now, winning the highest number of seats, not necessarily the confidence of the House. And conversely, what does Justin Trudeau and the Liberals need to do to win the next election?
So I think for Poilievre, his path to power is pretty clear to me. He has to, and he's doing half of it very well so far, I would say. He has to go and gain those voters that should be conservative, but they're not. So I'm talking Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. It's weird that those places still vote Liberals. It doesn't fit with the global realignment. They're non-urban area. They're maybe not socially conservative, although some of them are, but they're at least culturally conservative, right? They're not going to be a big fan of drag queen shows imposed on children and these type of things. So, Northern Ontario, rural BC, like on the island in the north, some of the NDP, they still have those holdover seats that they shouldn't have, because under Jack Meeting, the NDP, they're a very urban, very woke party. So there is no reason they still get this working class, trade workers or on the island and in the interior. So those seats, I think, especially those NDP seats or Liberal seats in the Atlantic, realignment should make it such that, and Poilievre should win those. And he has been doing pretty well with those by talking about hunting, this type of thing. So I'm pretty confident that he flips those seats. That brings you to 140. He needs more than 140 to win the next election. So the next is, you have two paths. Either you finally win some in the 905, or you win in Quebec. I think Quebec is not looking great. And the problem for the Conservative in Quebec is essentially they need to get beyond 25% to really see a return. Anything between 15 and 25, it's a difference between 9 and 11 seats. So it's almost a waste of time. So you don't want, so if you go in, you have to go in and you're like, we're going to go and we want 30% in Quebec. But they're not doing this. They decided to try to reach out to minorities, right, in the 905, right, in particular Indiana 6, right, and he's doing outreach. I don't know if those voters will really be likely to switch to the Conservative. I mean, O'Toole was very terrible with minorities and in outreach. Obviously when you do most of your campaign from a green screen room in Ottawa, that doesn't help. And when people don't know you, especially when your opponent is Justin Trudeau. So he needs to do this. If he's not, he doesn't need to flip all of the 905, right? We don't need to see a blue wave like 2011, but he needs to make gains. And so if he doesn't make gains, I think really the backup plan would be, there is, Windsor, southwestern Ontario, where you have a few seats out there that should be blue, and they're blue at the provincial level. And maybe they could go flip those one. But again, the one test we had was Oxford, and their margin went from 27 to 6 or 8, something like this. So
6.
That wasn't, so that's not a really good sign, notwithstanding all the local effects in place. So, if you look at the map in 2021, of the seats where the PPC split the vote enough to cause defeat of the Conservative, it's 21 seats, right, across Canada. Those are the seats I just referred to. They're in Northern Ontario, Southwestern Ontario, some in BC. So I think those seats should be the one that flip first. And, the strategy of Poilievre has been, let's go get the PPC back. Not all of them, but let's say half of the PPC. And that brings us to 35, 36, 140 seats. And then just go get some votes from the minorities in the 905 with better vote targeting. Go get back Richmond in BC with the Chinese vote. Those seats should never have flipped. I get them, there is obviously the Chinese influence from the Chinese government, but it's not the only reason why the CPC lost those seats. It's also because there was almost zero outreach out there.
Now, you did mention the PPC and Maxime Bernier. So are there any issues that you foresee that Bernier and the PPC can jump on over the next 2 years that may, again, deny Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives not only a chance at forming government, but potentially a chance at winning additional seats, like you just mentioned?
Yeah, so I would say the main two that come to mind right now would be, the first one is some self-owned by the Conservative, like when you reprimand Leslie Lewis on meeting with an elected member of the European Parliament. I think this, all of a sudden, you lose a lot of goodwill you had with those PPC voters that supported you in the leadership race, and all of a sudden, like, well, what the hell, why would we support Poilievre? And they're going to have to start talking about the WEF and whatnot. So, I mean, it's possible to lose them. We just saw in rural Manitoba how hard they had to go to keep those voters. So, I mean, those voters could be very flaky.
Brandon Leslie is now one of the most social conservative members of Parliament.
Yes. So, but it takes a lot, and you cannot replicate this, during a general election. So it would be easy to have those voters like flake back to the PPC or not voting at all. The other issue, assuming that, COVID is over and COVID mandate freedom will not come into play, immigration. I think if the PPC has an opening, it's either on some culturally conservative thing like drag queen, trans, abortion to some extent, but I think less. Otherwise, immigration. That's the one issue where even to this day, we saw it yesterday where when Poilievre was asked, hey, we talk a lot about the supply, but maybe we should be talking about the demand and how we have 1.2 million people coming to Canada every year. And Poilievre didn't even want to talk about this, completely, ignore the question anyone with the supply. So I think at some point, if we keep seeing situations where it's a crisis, right? It's a housing crisis where we have now people who make good money and they cannot even qualify for a mortgage in Vancouver. That's like literally for a condo. And so if we start seeing this and we see those prices everywhere in Kelowna, everywhere except rural Quebec, And really all the parties are just there. We need to pump those immigration numbers. I think there is an opening. Is it a big one? No, because I think Canadians like immigrations in general outside of Quebec, but it's an opening nonetheless. And Bernie doesn't need to get many votes to cost the Conservative the win, right? Again, you 21 seats in 2021. So I know it's wrong to assume that all the PPC would have voted Conservative in 2021, fair enough, but many would have. Yeah. And again, if you lose those, and what if you start losing them in the suburb? Because you start having people so upset they cannot leave their home in the suburb, and only one guy is telling them, well, yeah, it's because every year we welcome 1 million more people and they take the houses. What if he managed to just get 5% in the 905? Then Poilievre doesn't flip those seats and he doesn't become prime minister.
Well, so speaking about, so I have two questions, and sorry, you brought something up, so I'll ask the first question and then I'll ask the second, which aren't quite exactly related. So I was thinking about the openings that might be presented to the PPC over the next 2 years, because of course, I'm assuming the next election is going to be in 2025, and that's a lot of time, right, between now and then, and lots of things can happen. But do you think that the PPC can choose both to embrace, hey, our immigration numbers are too high, and drag queen storytime hour being forced at schools like they're talking about in the Toronto District School Board is also not good, and we're going to talk about that because the people generally, at least here in Ontario, that are coming out to protest these things, and I don't think these protests are going away anytime soon, despite what a lot of people, I think, in the office of Leader of the Opposition would like. A lot of these people are from, for example, the Muslim community or the Sikh community. So do you think Maxime Bernier can go out there and go in with these people and protest with them in front of these school board offices and say, we're against this gender ideology being taught in our school systems, and then the next day go and give a speech and say we have too many immigrants coming into Canada? Do you think he can do this, or do you think he's going to have to choose between one or the other? And then the last question I have, is we were about a year away since when Pierre Poilievre became leader of the Conservative Party. Over the past almost 12 months, what kind of grade would you give him? And given where the Conservatives are at and the polls and everything like that, does it meet your expectations? Is it below your expectations or above your expectations?
All right. So for Bernier, it's obviously, it seems contradictory, although it does assume that, Muslim or Sikhs or minorities that live in Canada already, their main focus would be to just have more people like them. And I think to some extent it's true, right? They want their family and other people. I'm not convinced that this is the only thing they really care about. And in particular, if you're parents of a kid and you really care, I think emotionally you will be much more moved by what the school curriculum is teaching your kids than by making sure that, somebody you don't know but that has the same skin color could come to this country. So I think there is an opening. It doesn't make for a very coherent campaign Canada-wide, but Maxime Bernier isn't looking for a coherent Canada-wide campaign. He's looking for some customers here and there, right? And so I think again, I don't think we're talking about the PPC winning seats, but we're talking about the PPC gaining enough or maintaining enough relevance that it's costing the Conservative those votes that it would like. So we also have to mention that Maxime Bernier is not really the best possible leader for what party is trying to get. I mean, he had already to reinvent himself after the leadership. He used to be the centrist, socially progressive libertarian, and now he's running in, Portage Lisga, and he's trying to go all in on abortion to get the German Mennonites. So, I mean, you can reinvent yourself in politics, but I mean, a guy with a French accent running in rural Manitoba is weird, I mean, but he cannot win in his own riding in Quebec. So
the posters for him and the advertising was Max Bernier and not Maxime Bernier.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah. No accent or anything. Yeah. No, so we will see, right? I'm just saying we're starting to see on immigration, we're starting to see something switching where we see academics, we see the Bank of Canada that openly say, we're starting to receive maybe too many people. And it seems there is a crown underground and nobody's picking it up. So Maxime Bernier has an opening there to remain relevant. Whether he picks it up correctly and is successful, we will see. But at least that's an opening that exists. And your other question was, how would I grade Poilievre? I think right after the election, the leadership election, until December of 2022, I think it was terrible. I mean, he spent weeks only talking about like the Canada pension plan, like, are you gonna not increase? Can you cancel those hikes? And like, this is boring. Nobody cares, but I think he had to build his team and around him and everything. I think since then he has been okay. I mean, a lot of time he has this energy he had during the leadership race.
Mm-hmm.
Again, me personally, I'm a little bit disappointed that if he decided to talk so much about housing, how scared he is of even talking about numbers. Like, we're not talking about going to zero, but at least maybe mention that, have a pause in those numbers, or limit the number of international students that are renting the units other people cannot rent. So I would like to see a little bit more courage from him on those things. And otherwise, in terms of attitude, he's fine. Change the glasses or remove the glasses to look nicer after focus group, I'm guessing. I don't want to see too much of what I would call like Erin O'Toole behavior, where you reprimand your MP for meeting with a German elected member, or where you don't want to talk about immigration. I mean, remember when the leadership was happening, one of the main reasons people were voting for Poilievre was, we like that we finally have a guy who isn't afraid to stand up and to be a proud conservative. And I feel sometimes on some issues, Poilievre seems to be scared, and they have their plan. It's not working right now, looking at, the by-elections. So, out of 100%, I would give him a B right now. He hasn't failed. And, objectively in the polls, he's much better placed than when O'Toole left. So, I mean, but he's better placed, but he's still only at 35, right? Which is the only reason he's really ahead is because the Liberals are at 29. But I don't trust.
And then, of course, most elections that comes back from the NDP, not all the time, and it's not a lot. Yeah, it's so funny you mentioned that, because if you think about it, the Conservatives went from 34 now to 35. Of course, Ontario really matters, but then in the polls you see, the NDP are at 24. I mean, like, besides Jack Layton, when are the NDP ever posting 24 in a general? Like, obviously that's coming back to the Liberals. What's not as obvious is that if the PPC do start pulling back at 5%, that does come back to the Conservatives.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that's one thing we maybe saw during those by-elections. I think the NDP has done terrible everywhere. Yeah. And I think we might have seen this scenario where the NDP is squeezed on both sides, right? It's going to lose the rural working class workers to Poilievre, but then the urban progressive woke voters of the NDP, they're now like, oh, no, we're going to go with Trudeau. We're not going to split the vote. And so we could end up with the NDP squeezed, but the Liberals doing pretty well in those urban ridings.
Do you foresee a situation where Pierre Poilievre wins more seats than Erin O'Toole, maybe pushing that 140, 135, 140, but because the NDP gets squeezed out, and maybe the Liberals have some sort of issue in Quebec, because we always forget about Quebec, right? It's the Blocs have 30 seats there. It's not like the Bloc have to keep those 30 seats forever. They could easily, well, maybe not easily, but they could lose 20 of those to the Liberals, because that has happened in the not too distant past. Could you foresee a situation where, yes, the Conservatives gain seats, but the Liberals also gain seats?
I don't think the Liberals can gain seats. I really don't believe they can. Well, okay, they can, not in total, but they could gain. They could make gains that could offset the losses they have. And yes, I think it's quite possible. And I've always been pretty convinced that Poilievre would win a minority next time. I'm a little bit less convinced of this. I would still put money on Poilievre winning next election in 2025, but I think there is now a very realistic scenario where, yes, the NDP, the strategic voting, and potentially the Bloc strategic voters in Quebec could allow the Liberals to remain at even 150. And so even ahead, or, even if they're not just behind, if Poilievre is 141 and the Liberals at 139, chances are, Trudeau could try to stay, right? So, and you're right, we haven't talked so much about Quebec. We're kind of assuming that the Bloc will hold, but in 2021, until the last 2 weeks and the Angus Reid questions on Quebec during the debate, the Liberals were set to make many gains. in Quebec. So there is always this possibility, and we see it in the polls between elections. There is always this possibility that somehow Trudeau will go back to closer to 2015 in Quebec and make many, many gains from the bloc. And that could especially happen if, Quebecers don't seem to like Pierre Poilievre. Really, they don't. I mean, by now. And so for multiple reasons. And so, yeah, if we end up in a campaign where the Conservatives are polling at 36, 37, and they're about to be projected as minority, I wouldn't be too surprised if some voters in Quebec are like, no, then let's go with Justin Trudeau.
Well,
Cut me off, Alissa. It's too much fun.
I was just going to say, you just made Scott's day, because the only person I feel like that we could possibly have on as a guest that would excite him so much about numbers would be you, Bryan. So thank you so much for coming on this podcast and for talking to us about the polls and especially engaging in it, but province by province, since a lot of the issues that we're talking about are in Atlantic Canada and different parts of not in Alberta or Ontario currently, where we're both from. So thank you so much for coming on, and we really appreciate it, and we'll be in touch, and you can keep us updated on the polls if people want to follow you and see your numbers. Where can they do that?
Well, I mean, I don't update my blog very much, so tooclosetocall.ca is there, and you can I have simulators, right, where you can enter your own numbers to make your own projections. I always share my model completely. It's literally the same model I use. Otherwise, if you want updates, you should follow me on Twitter, right, at tooclosetocall. Just find me there. And I mean, for instance, I think in the next few months, I will most likely spend a lot of time trying to cover the Ontario Liberal leadership election, not because people really care, but
invigorating.
Nobody else will do it. So, and that's where really I post updates. And what is the next election? BC? Technically BC.
Manitoba.
Yeah, Manitoba, right? I don't have a model for Manitoba. I should maybe build one. I have my BC model now, but otherwise, by elections, federal polling, when we have a big swing, I always make projections or analysis. So.
Alissa, it was my birthday 2 days ago, so this was a great birthday gift to me.
Oh, well,
happy birthday.
Happy belated birthday. And it was fun. I'm always in, when I'm invited. My wife was like, why, who are there? Like, I can show me. And who are you talking to? So you're talking to strangers? I'm like, I'm not talking to strangers. I know them.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks again for coming on, and make sure that our listeners, that you follow Bryan on Twitter and check out his website. So thanks so much. And make sure that you like and subscribe to us on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, wherever you get your podcasts. You can make sure that you don't miss out on some more summer guests. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us.
Bye for now.
Nature communicates with us in a universal language. The sunrise starts a new day. The sunset marks our accomplishments.
The most beautiful communication is where the speaker and the listener match perfectly and understand the same message.
Your future audience is waiting to hear from you. What message do you need to share?
At LaRosse Media, we fashion beautiful communications through our professional video production services and marketing strategies.
Create your own most beautiful message. Visit larosmedia.com and be sure to check out our extended service options.
Dream, produce, market, succeed with LaRosse Media.
Serving Canada from coast to coast to coast.